Did you know that despite knitting being a thing for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, knitted sweaters are actually a really new thing? Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're talking about and making an 18th century sweater. Instead of the cozy knits that we would associate with sweaters nowadays, in the 18th century it was much more common to quilt them. Quilting has a long tradition, and it was an easy way of making a warm garment. And they were extremely popular in the 18th century. You can find quilted items from petticoats to actual quilts to different sorts of jackets, short gowns, bed gowns, and even full-on robe à la française. For most of the 18th century, the robe à la française or sackback gown is the most formal gown there is, other than the court gown, which typically is only worn for court. Since we have even in these garments surviving examples of quilted garments, that tells you exactly how popular of a way of making a warm garment this actually was in this era. But just like the knit sweater or sweatshirt of today, these garments were worn by all classes, and they could be found in various different price ranges and different qualities. There's a variety of different sorts and different levels of surviving garments. You can find everything from the fancy quilted satin sackback gown to a very plain linen quilted jacket or short gown, and anything and everything in between. Quilted petticoats especially were very ambiguous to the era, and you can find so many surviving examples of them. But one of the reasons I think that there are so many more surviving examples of petticoats is because those could be also worn in the later eras, so they would be preserved and kept instead of broken down to some other garments. Whereas I think a lot of jackets and short gowns and even bed gowns and different sorts of smaller upper body garments were oftentimes, when they went out of fashion, they were reused as different sorts of garments. Maybe you made a baby blanket out of it, or maybe a bonnet for a baby, or different sorts of houseware items and baby items, so that you could still get use out of that garment even though it wasn't any more fashionable, whereas the petticoat still stayed fashionable and it became an undergarment that you could wear well into the Victorian era and even beyond. As for actual knits, like I said, knitting had been a thing for thousands and thousands of years. The first knitted garments were made with null binding. So that is making a knit fabric with a single needle forming a series of knots that make that fabric. But the more modern day knitting using two or more needles had been around at least since the Renaissance, but it was commonly used for accessories like stockings, gloves, mittens, and purses. Looking at how many countries and regions have traditional knits, it would be easy to think that knitted wool sweaters go back hundreds and hundreds of years. But in truth, they don't really go back further than the 19th century. But that's not to say that they didn't have larger knits in the 18th century and beyond. In the 17th century and the 18th century, there are some examples of surviving upper body sweater kind of garments. But they are not what we would consider, a warm cardigan or sweater or sweatshirt kind of garment. They were more pretty items, and they were knit usually with silk, and they were shown more as a sign of your skills. It was made to show off how good of a knitter you are, rather than a utilitarian garment for warmth, which was the quilted garments. Since a lot of these quilted garments have actually an outer fabric of silk, it would be easy to think that these are, very much fancy garment, but they were considered very much a utilitarian garment, something that you would wear casually around the house, and something that you could even wear in a state of undress. So they would really be kind of your sweatpants of the 18th century. That was really the garment that you could just lounge around at home, but you could also leave the house in, especially if you weren't upper class. That is the garment, if you did grocery shopping, which upper class would not do their own grocery shopping, If you did your own grocery shopping, you could just throw on your quilted short gown or quilted petticoat or your quilted bedgown, and you could go do your shopping in that. It just like we can nowadays wear our sweatpants while we go shopping. To explain the difference between levels of formality in these quilted items in the 18th century, I'm going to use modern equivalents, as in they're not exact equivalents, but they're going to be like, they're going to give you an idea of in what kind of situations you could wear each of these items. The most casual, so basically your at-home sweatshirt and sweatpants that you could wear, you know, doing regular house things, that you could wear lounging around, you could wear when you weren't bothering to actually get dressed, but you could still be seen in public if you were not the very uppermost class. Those garments would be either the bedgown and the short gown, and then you could have a quilted petticoat with that. Which one of these items you would have really depended mostly on your location. If you lived in continental Europe or Scandinavia, you would choose a short gown. If you lived in England, or you were English descent living in the colonies or later the United States, then you would most likely choose a bedgown. These are both easy to make T-shaped garments that don't have a separate sleeve and body to them. So they're very similar, but there are differences. Whereas the bedgown is made with a shaped piece at the very back, and it is cut, the body is cut in one piece, and then you make slashes to it. The short gown is made so that you make one half together, and then there is a center back seam that then seams these two halves of the garment together. Whereas a bedgown is made without a center back seam. Both of these garments can be also made non-quilted. They can be made for the more upper class out of silk, or they can be made for the lower classes out of linen or wool for the winter. Then your modern day equivalent to your jeans and t-shirt with a sweater kind of combo is a jacket with a petticoat. There's a huge variety of different kinds of jackets, but the main key element is that a jacket is a more fitted garment that needs to be made to the body, whereas these other garments, these T-shaped garments, could be bought in standard sizes ready-made at the milliners. And because of the more fitted nature of these garments, they also have a fitted sleeve. So that means the sleeve is not cut in one with the body, and it also has a shoulder seam, and it has an arm side. So it needs to be fitted much more to the body, and this would be made for the customer rather than ready-made. Most sleeves throughout the 18th century are quarter length, but because this is a warm garment, this is intended for warmth, they do actually have full-length sleeves in these. And sometimes you can also see full-length sleeves that are done with kind of sleeve detailing that would emulate the sleeve ending and then just an extra added on piece. Even though it is just one garment, it usually is done by adding trimming on top of the quilting rather than having actual separate pieces of sleeve. And these quilted jackets can come in all the styles that regular jackets in the 18th century can come. Oh, and a key feature, even though we're talking about jackets, in the 18th century that basically means your bodice, not an outdoor garment. And lastly, your 18th century quilted gowns would be kind of like your modern day jersey maxi dress. So in a style and length that would be associated more with a more formal garment, but still casual and easy to wear. This time we're going to be making a quilted short gown, because the short gown or the bedgown were both garments that were very practical and used in multiple different occasions. This is a garment that you could use on its own, just as your casual sweatshirt, or you could use it as a layering piece in the cold. You could use it underneath your cape or cloak, or you could use it by itself, depending on the temperature and how cold you are. So basically, the use of this garment is pretty much exactly the same as our modern day sweater or cardigan is. It is an item that you can use in most occasions, and every woman basically has a version of it in their wardrobe. I'm making mine with a silk taffeta outer fabric, and the quilting batting is going to be cotton, and the lining fabric is going to be linen. This is a very common example of different sorts of fibers that were available in the 18th century. For batting, they would typically use either cotton or wool, and the lining could be sometimes wool, but most often it was either a linen or cotton print. Silk taffeta is by far the most popular fiber choice for the outer fabric. Though there are many examples also of silk satin, and even there are some examples of cottons and linens as outer fabrics. Even though we might associate silk taffeta with formal wear, in the 18th century, silk taffeta would have actually been accessible to most classes. So this is an item that can be worn by most people. So that makes this a very useful item for the modern day historical costumer's wardrobe, because you can wear this both with your more average interpretations of the people of the 18th century, and you can also wear this with upper class garments. Most of the surviving examples that I can find of quilted short gowns are of Swedish origin, and they tend to usually have silk cuffs of a different shade of silk. I don't know if this was intended to match a quilted petticoat that was maybe a different color than the main body of the jacket, but that's at least how I'm interpreting it. So I'm not going to put the cuffs on yet, because I'm yet to buy the fabric that I'm going to use for making the quilted petticoat that will eventually someday complete this set. So I'm going to leave the cuffs off. I'm just going to turn in the cuffs and finish them that way, so that there is no raw edges there, so that it is completely wearable as it is. But I am eventually going to add those cuffs of a different silk. But without the quilting, this sort of short gown can be basically made out of any fiber that existed in the 18th century. Just keep in mind that if it was made out of something without the quilting, most likely, unless it was really heavy wool, it would be slightly more fitted than this example. And as for the thickness of the batting, there seems to be a little bit of variety in this. Some look like they are a little bit heavier quilted, and some look like they're very, very thinly quilted. I'm using a very thin cotton quilting, but it still is a very warm garment. I start by cutting out the pattern pieces out of the lining, fashion fabric, and batting. Then I take my lining fabric and draw the quilting pattern directly onto the lining. It is very common to see pencil markings on extant garments, so this is completely period accurate. And this method works well as long as your batting isn't too thick. If your batting is on the thicker side, then you'll want to transfer the pattern on with something that can be erased onto the fashion fabric side, so that you can work from that side, so that you can make sure that the stitches look even. And when working on the other side, I make sure that the lines line up and the pattern is mirrored on the other side. In the era, these garments could be bought ready-made, or you could buy the fabric pre-quilted, or you could make it completely from scratch at home. Typically, you can tell if it was pre-quilted and then made later by the fact that then the patterns won't usually match. Well, I hit a snag before I got very far. My pieces are cut out, but I left my silk on the back of a chair, and because I don't live alone, that chair got moved, and then it got moved next to a hair conditioner with an oil base, and now I have oil stains on my silk. So we will try to get those out. I'm going to be using dish soap and Q-tips to rub first the oil stain off, and then we'll try to remove this stain with alcohol, and hopefully that will evaporate and not leave a stain, and I can still use this silk. If not, I'll have to recut it. As the alcohol, I'm using just the cheapest vodka I could find. Then I layer all 3 layers of fabric on top of each other. Then I baste all layers together, essentially using a ginormous pad stitch. This helps keep the fabrics together without shifting and allows me to work without an embroidery hoop or quilting frame. I actually hate working with embroidery hoops and try to avoid them as much as possible. I find it that when I work with the fabric loose in my hand, I can bunch up the fabric and work multiple stitches at a time, and I find that much faster and easier. I work in a running stitch and try to keep it close to 8 stitches per inch, because that is pretty average for the era. After finishing the diamond pattern, I draw flowers onto the centers of the diamonds, and then I stitch those. These are stitched on with a tighter running stitch, about 12 stitches per inch, to make the flowers pop out more. And now that the quilting is done, the garment construction starts. I first start by backstitching the side seams all the way from the hem to the wrist on both pieces separately, and then I backstitch along the center back seam connecting the 2 pieces together. Then I trim down all the seam allowances, leaving enough of the silk that I can turn over the raw edges and hem that down. And after all those seam allowances are hemmed down, I go ahead and fold over all the raw edges on the garment and hem those down as well. And then I hem the cuffs down. The contrasting silk cuff will be added onto this, so this is just a temporary fix. And then we take out all those basting threads. So here's the little dent at the neckline where like the V forms, so that this is like the bodice and this is the neckline. So that's where the first ribbon comes to. Unlike bed gowns, which typically close with separate pins, short gowns typically close with ribbons that are attached to them. These ribbons that I'm using are temporary ones. Once I decide on the petticoat color, I'm going to use the matching silk to make the ribbons too. Here is the finished short gown for now, and this could be left as it is. I'm just wanting to recreate more of the original by adding those cuffs and that petticoat and that other detailing. On its own, it works to about freezing, and then when it goes below like it was on this day, I rather wear a cloak on top of it. I made mine to have the slightly looser shape and longer sleeves so that it could work throughout the 18th century, even though here I have specifically styled it for the 1770s, but that has more to do with my hair and other features rather than the short gown itself. Well, that's it for today, folks. I'm glad you had watched it till now, and I hope you hit that like button, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye!